At the edge of the desert, when the air has grown cool and the shadows have lengthened, an ancient wall can seem almost to breathe. A doorway stands open, a column catches the last light, and somewhere beyond it, a lamp is lit by a hand we will never know. It is easy to think of ancient civilizations as distant, simple, or half understood, but the more quietly we look, the more careful they seem, the more patient, the more precise. Tonight we can drift through that old precision and let it settle the mind. There is a gentle kind of surprise in ancient history. It does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it appears in a brick laid at the right angle, or in a road that still knows how to carry a wheel, or in a jar made to protect grain from damp air. These are small things, and yet they matter. Civilizations do not become advanced only through kings, wars, and monuments. They become advanced through bread ovens, water channels, written accounts, carpenter's marks, and the quiet willingness to make life work a little better. So if we ask whether ancient civilizations were more advanced than we think, the answer may be softer than a simple yes or no. The answer may be that they were advanced in ways we often forget to value. They understood materials, seasons, measurements, labor, storage, travel, and time. They built for survival, but they also built for memory. And in that balance, there is something deeply human and deeply calming. In ancient Egypt, for example, people often picture pyramids first. They picture size and stone and the long, patient labor of moving something heavy into place. That image is real, and it is astonishing, but it is only one part of the story. Behind the famous monuments was an entire world of administration and craft. Scribes kept records of grain. Surveyors measured fields after the Nile changed its banks. Builders knew how to align structures with astonishing care. Bakers, brewers, fishers, boatmen, and cloth workers made the daily system hold together. A civilization like Egypt did not rest on a single wonder. It rested on repetition, on knowing when the river would rise, on storing surplus, on organizing workers, on understanding that a wall is only as useful as the mortar that holds it, and that a granary is only as secure as the habits of those who fill it. The pyramids may still feel like a riddle, but the broader society around them was practical, measured, and alert to details that would keep a kingdom fed. And there is something quietly modern about that. We sometimes imagine the ancient world as if people lived by instinct alone, but they did not. They planned, they calculated, they copied. They revised, they trained apprentices. They passed along specialized knowledge from one generation to the next. A good potter could improve a shape until the vessel stacked more safely or heated more evenly. A mason could choose stone with a practiced eye. A physician could compare symptoms, preparing remedies from plants, honey, oils, and minerals. Much of this knowledge was local, but local knowledge can be extraordinarily refined. The same is true in ancient Greece, though the Greek world felt different in structure and scale. Instead of one long kingdom, there were city-states, islands, colonies, ports, and competing traditions. This created friction, certainly, but it also created variety. Ideas moved from one place to another. Philosophers asked questions in shaded courtyards. Shipbuilders worked along the coast. Mathematicians traced patterns that still feel elegant today. In some cities, citizens debated law and public life with a seriousness that can still seem fresh. Yet even there, the brilliance was not only in debate. It was also in the practical life underneath the debate. Greek houses were arranged for shade and privacy. Markets relied on weight and measure. Potters developed forms that carried oil, wine, and water across land and sea. Wrestlers trained the body, but so did shepherds, rowers, and laborers. The culture celebrated thought, but it also depended on hands. A civilization becomes advanced not only when it can think clearly, but when it can feed itself, transport goods, and preserve skill. Rome, too, carries this dual quality. People often remember Roman armor, marble, and empire, but the deeper genius of Rome lay in systems. Roads connected regions. Aqueducts moved water over long distances. Concrete allowed builders to shape arches, vaults, and domes with a confidence that still feels almost calm in its logic. The Romans were not merely impressive because they built big things. They were impressive because they built repeatable things. Things that could be copied, things that could last, things that made a city feel less fragile. A Roman street at dusk may have held the smell of cooked fish, damp stone, and smoke from a small hearth. A traveller could hear sandals on pavement, a cart wheel passing, a dog barking near a doorway. And beneath all of that ordinary noise was engineering. Drainage channels, public baths, sealed pipes, legal records, warehouses. The quiet machinery of empire did not always look noble, but it kept daily life moving. In that sense, a civilization's true advancement may be found not in its most famous monument, but in its least noticed convenience. It is easy from a distance to underestimate ancient logistics, but logistics is one of the oldest forms of intelligence. To move wheat from field to silo, from silo to ship, from ship to city market, and from market to household requires trust, timing, accounting, transport, and infrastructure. The people who made those systems work were not lesser than the people whose names survived. They were part of the same long intelligence expressed in a quieter key. And then there is writing, which changes everything and yet remains strangely humble. We think of writing as literature, but most ancient writing was practical. Lists, receipts, tax records, letters asking for olive oil, linen, or a replacement tool. In cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, in Egyptian hieroglyphic records, in Greek inscriptions, in Roman accounts, we find the habits of organized life. Writing allowed people to step outside memory. It gave societies a longer reach. It let an order survive a season, a year, a generation. There is something soothing in that continuity. A person from long ago worried about the same ordinary things that still occupy us now. Food, shelter, weather, work, family, time. The surviving records do not always speak in grand tones. Often they are surprisingly plain. A list of beer, a note about bricks, a message about a borrowed tool. This plainness can feel almost intimate. It lets us glimpse a civilization not as a museum of achievements, but as a living arrangement of needs and solutions. Sometimes advanced knowledge hides in materials. Ancient peoples understood stone, clay, metal, wood, textile, and pigment with a closeness that modern life can easily forget. A textile worker knew which fibers would wear well. A shipwright knew how wood behaved in water and salt. A metalworker understood heat, alloy, and timing. These were not abstract theories alone. They were embodied knowledge, learned through touch and repetition. One hand passed a skill to another hand, and the skill survived. In Egypt, the making of papyrus itself was a form of technological elegance. In Greece, the shaping of amphorae supported trade across the sea. In Rome, the use of pozzolana and other building materials gave strength to structures that still inspire admiration. Across the ancient world, practical invention was everywhere, though it rarely announced itself. It lived in the background of daily life, where most real civilization lives. We sometimes assume that sophistication must look like electricity, engines, or glass towers, but sophistication can also look like balance, a city aligned to wind and shade, a temple positioned to catch sunrise at a certain angle, a house with a courtyard that allows heat to rise away from the rooms, a storehouse raised to protect grain from damp and animals. These decisions were intelligent responses to place. They were technology in the broadest, oldest sense. And perhaps that is one reason ancient civilizations can feel so restful to imagine. They were alert to the world because they had to be. They watched the sky. They watched water. They watched the behavior of animals and the timing of crops. Their lives were not easy, but they were closely knit to reality in a way that modern life often is not. There is a calmness in that closeness, even when the circumstances were difficult. Of course, ancient societies were not gentle in every respect. They had inequality, hardship, and injustice. Power was unevenly distributed. Slavery existed in many forms. Many hands carried burdens without being remembered. It is important not to romanticize that. Yet even here, the study of ancient life reveals complexity rather than simplicity. A society can be morally troubled and technically brilliant at once. Human history often holds both truths in the same room. If we stay with the idea of advancement, we can think not only of invention but of administration. The ability to count, tax, distribute, assign, and archive is easy to overlook, and yet these are foundational skills. Ancient Egypt had officials who managed labor and grain. Babylonian and Assyrian systems recorded astronomical observations and economic transactions. Greek polis organized civic life in different ways. Rome built layers of bureaucracy that could send orders across distance. None of this is glamorous in the usual sense, but it is what turns a settlement into a state. The ancient world was also full of measurement, measures of grain, of land, of weight, of time. Sundials, water clocks, calendars, and star observations gave shape to the day. To measure time by shadow or flowing water is a quieter experience than checking a glowing screen, and perhaps a more attentive one. You have to listen to the day. You have to notice light moving across a stone. You have to accept that time is not only something you use, but something that passes through the world. In many places, astronomy and religion were closely linked. The sky was not empty above them, it was meaningful. The rising of a star might mark the season to plant. The movement of a constellation might guide a ritual. The moon might shape the timing of travel or ceremony. Even if their explanations differed from ours, their observations were often careful. A civilization can be scientifically advanced in one area and spiritually symbolic in another, without contradiction. Human thought has never lived in only one room, and so when we ask what ancient people knew, it helps to imagine them not as isolated geniuses, but as communities of practice. A temple architect consulted with priests, laborers, masons, and astronomers. A physician learned from patients, predecessors, and local plants. A farmer paid attention to moisture in the soil, to the color of the sky, to insects and birds. Knowledge was rarely cleanly separated. It lived in networks like reeds woven into a basket. That basket image is worth keeping for a moment. A basket looks simple from a distance, but each strand must bend in the right place. Each crossing must hold. If one part weakens, the whole shape changes. Ancient societies were like that. Trade, faith, craft, law, and family life were woven together. If we pull too hard on one strand, such as the famous monuments, we can miss the structure that made them possible. We can also miss the domestic side of ancient intelligence. In homes, people arranged sleeping spaces, cooking areas, storage niches, and washing places with practical care. In many regions, a family's kitchen would not resemble a modern room, but it still reflected thought about smoke, heat, smell, and convenience. A clay lamp could cast a small warm circle of light. A shelf could keep bread off the floor. A jar might preserve olives through a season. These are humble accomplishments, and perhaps that is why they are so easy to overlook. The fact that ancient civilizations built with such awareness does not mean they possessed every modern convenience. It means they solved the problems in front of them with the means they had, often with great elegance. That is a kind of advancement worth remembering. Not a myth of perfection, but a record of competence. There is another reason we underestimate them. Time has not been kind to the ordinary things. Stone survives better than wood. Metal survives better than cloth. Inscriptions survive better than voices. What remains is distorted toward the monumental. So we see what was durable, and then we imagine that durability was the whole culture. But the daily world was fuller than that. Baskets, sandals, ropes, coats, toys, tools, and kitchen vessels once occupied most of the living space of any city. Their disappearance makes the past look more bare than it really was. Archaeology helps restore some of that fullness. A broken figurine in a house floor, a shard of painted pottery, a carbonized loaf of bread, a seal impression on clay, a drain beneath a street. These fragments are quiet, but they are persistent. They tell us that ancient people built systems for ordinary needs, and that those systems were often more organized than we expect. There is comfort in the thought that the past was not only epic but domestic. The more we look, the more we find that ancient life depended on attention. Attention to seasons, to ingredients, to movement, to maintenance. A civilization is not only created by invention, it is maintained by care. A road must be repaired, a harbour dredged, a canal cleared, a roof patched, a ledger checked, a field rested. Ancient peoples knew this because they lived close enough to consequences to feel them quickly. Rome in particular gives many examples of maintenance as intelligence. Aqueducts required upkeep, baths required fuel, cleaning and management, streets needed drainage, public buildings needed repair. The grandeur of Roman architecture can sometimes hide the fact that systems are only as good as their ongoing attention. This is true of empires, and it is true of houses. It may be one of the oldest truths in human life. And in Greece, the scale of the polis encouraged another kind of maintenance, the maintenance of public debate, public memory, and public identity. Festivals repeated, laws were recited, myths were performed, athletic contests returned each season. Repetition was not sameness, it was a way of keeping continuity alive. Many ancient cultures understood that memory must be practiced, not merely possessed. A story remembered once is fragile. A story retold becomes part of the place. Even the myths of these civilizations can be read as forms of preservation. They hold older fears, older hopes, and older answers. A god of grain speaks to the difficulty of hunger. A hero's descent into the underworld speaks to loss. A flood story remembers the power of water. A temple legend recalls the need for order. Whether taken literally or symbolically, these stories helped people locate themselves within a larger pattern, and that too is a kind of social technology. The ancient world also had a deep relationship with silence. Not every place was noisy in the modern sense. Dawn in a village could be full of birds, soft footfalls, the creak of a cart, and the low murmur of labor beginning. In a temple district, there might be moments when the city's sound seemed to thin out. In a library or archive, the air itself could feel carefully held. Ancient advancement often had a quiet side. It created spaces of order within the uncertainty of life. And there were moments of surprise too. An engineering feat that held back water, a medical treatment that eased pain, a ship that crossed farther than expected, a bridge that remained stable through a season of storms. People then, as now, were likely to feel a mixture of pride and relief when something worked. We do not always know the names of the builders, but their success remains in the shape of the surviving world. If we move eastward and southward beyond the familiar trio of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the pattern continues. In Mesopotamia, cities developed irrigation systems, legal codes, and scribal schools. In the Indus Valley, urban planning, drainage, and standardized weights suggest a strong sense of order. In China, ancient dynasties developed calendrical systems, bureaucracy, bronze casting, and large-scale statecraft. Across many regions, the ancient world shows not one line of progress, but many parallel efforts to make civilization coherent. This broad view helps soften the old habit of seeing ancient peoples as primitive by default. They were different, yes. Their knowledge was shaped by different materials, different languages, and different needs. But difference is not the same as lack. In some cases, they were remarkably sophisticated within their own constraints. They made trade routes, wrote contracts, mapped stars, treated bodies, and built cities that could endure longer than their creators expected. And sometimes what seems most advanced is not the flashiest thing at all. It is the presence of standards, consistent weights, reliable calendars, legal forms, architectural proportions, familiar road widths, predictable storage methods. A society that can standardize parts of itself gains a kind of stability. The ancient world understood this well. Even where there was variation, there was often a careful effort to create repeatable forms. A potter making dozens of vessels is practicing standardization. A scribe copying a text is preserving a form. A stonemason cutting blocks to similar sizes is making transport and assembly easier. These acts may not appear grand, but they are among the foundations of durable culture. We live among their descendants every day. There is also the matter of beauty. Ancient civilizations were not only practical, they cared how things looked, sounded, and felt. A temple column could be structurally useful and visually graceful. A cup could fit the hand well and still be painted with scenes. A tool could be functional and shaped with care. This union of utility and beauty is one of the oldest signs of a mature civilization. It suggests that people were not just trying to survive, they were trying to live well. That phrase, live well, might be the quiet center of the entire question. Were ancient civilizations more advanced than we think? Perhaps they were not advanced in the way our century tends to define the word, but in terms of practical intelligence, social organization, architectural knowledge, environmental awareness, and the steady refinement of everyday life, they were astonishingly capable. They were not stumbling through history in darkness. They were making choices, learning from errors, and leaving evidence of care. And because they did this without our machines, their achievements can seem even more remarkable. No satellites, no modern engines, no digital databases, yet they mapped, counted, transporting, and coordinated across great distances. They tracked the Nile, they followed the sea, they watched planetary cycles, they built archives, they organized labor. They remembered how to make things last. If you imagine a quiet evening in an ancient city, the scene becomes almost tender. A water seller walks home, a lamp is trimmed, a child is called inside, a baker seals a shop. Somewhere nearby, a civic officer copies a note into a ledger. A stone wall keeps the day's warmth a little longer. The city settles. The knowledge does not disappear, but it rests for a time inside walls and vessels and minds. We can think of each civilization as leaving behind not only monuments but habits. The habit of measuring, the habit of recording, the habit of building for shade, the habit of storing grain, the habit of arranging space to suit human use. These habits are quiet forms of genius. They do not always make headlines in the modern imagination, but they are what allow civilizations to exist at all. And even now, as we sit with these thoughts, there is a small lesson in their endurance. The ancients remind us that advancement is not only about speed, it is also about patience, not only about novelty but about continuity, not only about power but about maintenance. To build a world that lasts, someone must care about the little things. Someone must count the bricks, repair the roof, label the jar, sharpen the tool, and write the list. In that way, ancient people may feel more familiar than distant. They were not unlike us in their hopes for stability, their interest in useful knowledge, their dependence on routine, and their longing to leave something behind that would outlast a single life. Their cities were made of stone, clay, wood, and labor. Their wisdom was made of observation, repetition, and memory. Their days were likely filled with more small tasks than great moments, just as ours are. And perhaps that is why the ancient world still holds our attention so gently. It does not only offer marvels, it offers continuity, a carved line in a wall, a canal still visible from above, a recipe copied into a manuscript, a street plan visible in ruins, a tomb painted with scenes of ordinary life. These fragments say in their own quiet way that human beings have long been trying to organize the world into something livable. Egypt, Greece, and Rome each did this differently. Egypt with river timing and monumental order. Greece with inquiry, civic identity, and artistic balance. Rome with engineering, law, and systems that reached across distance. Together they reveal that ancient civilization was not a single fading candle, but many lamps, each burning with its own kind of steady light. If we continue to look, we may find that the real surprise is not that the ancients were advanced, but that they were advanced in ways we still recognize. They liked reliability. They trusted skilled labor. They valued records. They understood that cities need water, roads, shelter, and law. They knew that time changes everything and that good work is one way of answering that change. And so the question softens, Not were they like us, but what did they know that we have forgotten, not as a challenge, just as a quiet invitation, a way of looking again, a way of noticing that intelligence can be patient, local, physical, and beautifully practical. Somewhere in the dimness of an old workshop, a craftsman might have smoothed the rim of a bowl until it felt right in the hand. Somewhere in a temple archive, a scribe might have pressed one more line into clay. Somewhere along a Roman road, a traveller might have paused beside a milestone and read the distance home. Somewhere on a Greek shore, a sailor might have looked at the wind and decided to wait until morning. These are ordinary moments, and yet they are the bones of civilization. As we drift toward the end of this quiet look at the ancient world, there is no need to force a conclusion. The past does not ask to be solved all at once. It only asks to be noticed slowly and with a little patience. The pyramids, the forums, the temples, the streets, the markets, the farms, the archives, the workshops, all of them remain in fragments, and in those fragments we can still sense a human confidence, modest and enduring. Ancient civilizations may not have been advanced in the ways our own age is most eager to celebrate, but they were advanced in the deeper work of making life possible. They were attentive, organized, inventive, and deeply practiced. They understood that civilization is not a single invention. It is a long habit of care. And as the night grows quieter, that idea can simply rest with us. The river once rose and fell. The road was once swept clean. The lamp was once lit. The record was once made. The bowl was once fired. The door once closed. The roof once repaired. The measure once checked. The work of the ancient world continues in the background of our own. So let the thought stay soft. Let the desert wall cool into darkness. Let the columns become silhouettes. Let the city lights of long ago fade gently, not as an ending, but as a settling. There is comfort in knowing that people have always tried to build something durable out of fragile days, and that in their quiet methods, we can still find a kind of peace. And if your mind is beginning to drift, it can drift here, among old stones and careful hands, among ledgers and lamps, among roads and rivers, among the patient intelligence of people who lived so long ago, and yet understood so much of what it means to keep a world together. In Egypt, the night sky would have been watched by priests, farmers, and travelers, each for slightly different reasons, and each with their own kind of attention. In Greece, a philosopher might have wondered whether order lives in the heavens or in the mind. In Rome, a night watchman might have paced a corridor, listening for a gate that needed closing. The same stars, the same darkness, the same human habit of making sense of the world while it is still dark. That habit has never fully gone away. We still count, still measure, still store, still repair, still write things down so they will not vanish too quickly. We still try to make a useful shape from uncertain material. In that sense, the ancient world is not only behind us, it is beneath us in the foundation of how we live. And so we can leave it there calmly with gratitude, not because every ancient question is answered, but because enough is known to admire the quiet intelligence of those distant lives. They were not merely builders of ruins, they were builders of systems, habits, and lasting forms of care. As the last lamp in an old room grows small, the room does not become empty, it simply becomes still. That is enough for now. The temples remain in memory, the roads remain in stone, and the old civilizations, in their patient way, continue to rest where we can almost hear them breathing softly in the dark. And yet, even in that stillness, there is always more to wonder about. The ancient world is never only what was preserved, it is also what slipped away. For every inscription that survived, there were many that wore off in rain or were recut into newer stone. For every library that left a trace in history, there were countless shelves of papyrus, leather, and wax that did not endure the centuries. What remains can feel abundant on a museum wall, but it is only a small shoreline against a much larger sea. That is part of what makes the topic so quietly enduring. We are not looking at a finished picture, we are looking at a mosaic with missing pieces, and the gaps themselves have a kind of beauty. They invite patience, they invite careful thought. They invite the possibility that ancient people were, in some respects, even more capable than we first assume, not because they possessed machines like ours, but because they learned to do difficult things with very little margin for error. A stone cutter in Egypt could shape a block to fit so closely that a knife blade might catch on the seam. A Greek builder could adjust proportions so a temple seemed balanced to the eye on a hillside under open sky. A Roman engineer could guide water across miles of uneven ground with a gradual slope so slight that it could barely be noticed while walking beside it. These are not spectacular gestures in the modern sense. They are quieter than that. They are disciplined gestures. They show a civilization teaching itself how to be precise. Precision is easy to overlook when we live among the conveniences of the present. A light switch works, a tap runs, a message arrives, and the hidden systems disappear into the background. But in the ancient world, systems were more visible because they had to be maintained by human memory, human strength, and human attention. If a canal silted up, someone noticed. If a road eroded, someone repaired it. If a calendar drifted, someone recalculated the heavens and the seasons. Civilization was not an abstract idea. It was a daily negotiation with reality. In Egypt especially, time itself seems to have been treated as something practical and sacred at once. The flooding of the Nile was not merely weather. It was a cycle that ordered planting, labor, taxation, and ritual. A river could become a clock if a culture learned how to read it. That kind of knowledge is easy to underestimate because it is not written in the language of equations alone. It lives in the habits of farmers, surveyors, and priests, in the repeated observation of the sky and the water and the soil. The same is true of medicine, which in the ancient world often lived between careful observation and inherited belief. In Egypt, some medical texts show a remarkably organized interest in wounds, fractures, and treatments. They do not read like modern textbooks, of course, but they reveal people who paid attention to the body with sincerity. In Greece, the tradition later associated with Hippocrates encouraged doctors to think about balance, environment, diet, and the patient's overall condition. Even where theory was imperfect, the impulse to observe closely was real. Rome, for its part, inherited much of this medical thought and also brought its own practical habits to the care of soldiers, citizens, and the infrastructure that supported them. Perhaps that is one way ancient civilizations were advanced in a sense that still matters. They made room for observation. They learned to notice patterns that repeated, and they passed that noticing along. A healer noticed the way a fever changed. An astronomer noticed when a star returned. A mason noticed how a column settled. A clerk noticed how a grain tally differed from one season to the next. Progress was often the slow accumulation of such noticing, and because so much depended on memory, ancient cultures also developed elegant ways of storing information. Tablets, scrolls, inscriptions, monumental lists, coin portraits, archives, genealogies, and oral traditions all served as different kinds of memory. A city could declare itself through its records. A temple could preserve its rituals through its texts. A family could extend its name through the careful keeping of lineage. In a world without instant retrieval, remembering was a civic skill. It is moving to think of this, not because the past was simpler, but because it was more exposed. A mistake could echo farther. A drought could change a generation. A broken bridge could alter trade. Yet these civilizations endured for centuries, even millennia, by learning how to make institutions from habit. They became advanced in the patient sense of knowing how to outlast uncertainty. The Egyptians, in particular, seem to understand that lasting work often depended on repetition rather than novelty. A wall painted with familiar colors, a tomb lined with spells, a statue placed to face a certain direction, a shrine swept, an offering renewed, a name inscribed again and again. There is something very gentle in that repetition. It says that a stable world is built not only once but maintained, like a lamp kept filled with oil. And then there is the question of the monuments themselves. the things that still stand when so much else has fallen. The pyramids have become symbols so familiar that their original context can seem almost unreal, yet they were not mere riddles in stone. They were the outcome of organization, labor, mathematics, surveying, logistics, and the deep social authority to concentrate effort across generations. When we ask how they were made, we are really asking how a society could plan so far ahead. That, too, is a kind of advanced thinking. It means imagining a future in which the work will still matter. In Greece, the monuments are often less massive and perhaps more delicate in feeling, but they too reveal a civilization of thought and restraint. The temples of the classical world were not simply shelters for gods. They were expressions of proportion, civic identity, and shared memory. Their columns and pediments, their sculpted friezes and careful alignments, all suggest a culture that wanted beauty to be legible. One could walk through a Greek sanctuary and feel that architecture itself had become a language of order. Greek thought, of course, reached far beyond architecture. The philosophers left behind questions that still drift through the centuries. What is the good life? What is justice? What is real? What can be known? Even when their answers differ, the method itself feels enduring. To wonder carefully is a civilization's quiet luxury, and Greece made wonder into an inheritance. Some of that inheritance was practical, as in mathematics, geometry, logic, and medicine. Some of it was literary, through epic poetry, tragedy, and dialogue. Some of it was political, in the experiments and failures of city-states that tried to govern themselves in different ways. The legacy is not tidy, but it is alive. Rome inherited so much and organized it into something grandly practical. If Egypt often seems like a civilization of continuity and Greece like a civilization of inquiry, Rome can seem like a civilization of administration. But that is only part of the picture. Roman administration was not dull in its own time. It was a form of ambition. To connect distant lands by roads, law, military supply, taxation, and urban planning required a vast mental map of empire. A Roman official might never see the farthest provinces, yet still think in terms of routes, supplies, dates, duties, and reporting lines. That is one reason Rome feels so modern in certain ways. It turned scale into a habit. There is a deep quiet in that fact. We often remember empires through their battles and rulers, yet the real machinery of empire rested on ordinary things. Roads had to be graded, bridges inspected, aqueducts maintained, grain measured, ledgers compiled, ships tracked, customs collected, deliveries arranged. A great city was not sustained by grandeur alone. It was sustained by regularity. The brilliance of Roman engineering was that it made regularity visible. The arches, sewers, baths, forums, and roads were all parts of a world that tried to function day after day. If we listen closely, we can hear how much of ancient life was devoted not to spectacle but to upkeep. This is true of every civilization. The dramatic moments are always fewer than the ordinary ones. The king is crowned once, but bread is baked every morning. The treaty is signed once, but the border is watched every night. The statue is unveiled once, but the pedestal is cleaned for decades. The ancient world was full of such maintenance, and in its maintenance we can glimpse wisdom. Some of the most remarkable ancient achievements may have been so deeply embedded in daily life that they no longer look remarkable at all. Take sanitation, for example. The Romans, especially in their larger cities, built systems of drainage and public bathing that, while far from modern standards, nevertheless show a serious interest in urban hygiene. Water moved through channels, waste moved away from homes, and public spaces were made more inhabitable. This required engineering, but also civic discipline. Infrastructure does not care for itself. Someone has to believe that cleanliness, access, and flow are worth planning for. The same is true of streets and roads. A Roman road was not just a line on a map. It was a promise that the state could connect places. It allowed soldiers to move, merchants to trade, messages to travel, and travelers to find their way by milestones and way stations. Along those roads, one might encounter inns, shrines, farms, stone markers, carts, and dust. There is something restful about imagining all that movement now reduced to silence. The road does not hurry. It simply remains, or its remnants do, beneath grass and soil and later building layers, waiting for archaeologists and wanderers to notice it again. And archaeology itself is a kind of bedtime subject, if there ever was one. It is slow by nature. It asks for patience, dust, careful excavation, and interpretation. A broken cup is not just a broken cup. It may reveal diet, trade, ritual, class, or the reach of a distant workshop. A coin found in a field may date a layer of soil. A wall fragment may tell where a house once ended. A child's toy, an oil lamp, a comb, a bronze pin, a butchered bone, a seed charred by ancient fire, all of these become pieces of a larger domestic dream. The domestic world is often where ancient life feels most intimate. It is easy to think of antiquity in terms of rulers and ruins, but people lived in rooms, courtyards, and apartments. They swept floors, fetched water, mended clothes, stored olives, ground grain, and told stories in the evening light. In Athens, the house could open around a courtyard where family life unfolded in shades and passing breezes. In Rome, apartment buildings crowded together in the city could rise and fall with the fortunes of rent and fire and commerce. In Egypt, homes might be built of mud brick, cooled by design and by the rhythm of the season. These were not theatrical settings. They were lived-in places, and their ordinariness is what makes them feel close. We can imagine a ceramic jar being set down on a shelf carefully because it holds oil or wine or grain and must not crack. We can imagine a mother waking before dawn, a boy carrying water, an elder remembering a festival from years ago, a shopkeeper arranging goods by the light from the doorway, a scribe moistening a reed pen, a laborer tying a sandal strap. These actions are so modest that they seem almost transparent, and yet they are what civilization is made of. This is why the question of whether ancient civilizations were more advanced than we think cannot be answered only by looking for dramatic proofs. It requires a gentler measure. How well could they organize food? How carefully could they preserve knowledge? How elegantly could they solve practical problems with limited materials? How much could they imagine collectively? When viewed this way, the ancient world appears not primitive but differently specialized. It excelled at survivability, memory, and adaptation. That adaptation was not always peaceful. Empires grew through conquest as well as administration. Cities were captured, destroyed, rebuilt. Borders shifted. Trade routes opened and closed. Temples were repurposed. Statues were buried, vandalized, or recarved. Yet even in instability, there is evidence of continuity. A conqueror often inherits what cannot easily be replaced. Roads remain useful to whoever rules them. Tax records can be repurposed. Local expertise survives change. In this way, civilizations are layered, not pure. One age sits atop another. That layered quality is especially visible in the classical Mediterranean. Egypt was ancient before Greece rose to prominence, and Greece was ancient before Rome became dominant, yet all three ended up touching one another through trade, war, alliance, curiosity, and imitation. Greek scholars studied Egyptian knowledge. Roman elites admired Greek culture. Egyptian cities under Hellenistic and then Roman rule absorbed new influences while keeping older traditions alive. The result was not a clean sequence, but a web of inheritance. It is comforting in a strange way to know that civilizations borrow from one another. It means no culture is entirely self-made. The ancient world was a long conversation across seas and deserts. A design for a column might travel from one coast to another. A god might take on a new name in a different city. A story might shift but keep its shape. A method of counting, measuring, or healing might cross language boundaries and survive in altered form. History is full of these migrations, quiet and persistent. Even myth moved this way. The myths of Egypt, Greece, and Rome were not sealed containers. They were living stories, flexible enough to absorb local meanings. A river god could be reimagined from one region to the next. A creation tale could keep its deep structure while changing its symbols. The underworld could be entered by a hero, a queen, or a wandering soul depending on the culture that told the story. Myth is one of the oldest technologies of memory. It carries identity through change, and perhaps that is why ancient myth still feels so close at night. When the mind loosens its daytime grip, it becomes more receptive to old patterns. The descent beneath the earth, the return of spring, the lost city under the waves, the wise figure at the edge of the road, the broken crown, the secret name, the lamp carried through darkness. These are not just stories. They are deep structures of attention. They teach us how humans once framed uncertainty. In Egypt, the world of the dead was not only feared, it was mapped, named, and ritually navigated. Tombs were decorated with texts to guide the soul. Offerings were made to sustain memory. Names were preserved so that a person might continue. There is something both solemn and tender about this. To remember the dead was not only affection, it was architecture for the soul. A tomb could be a house for eternity, and a text could become a bridge. The Greeks, too, gave the underworld a rich geography. Rivers, gates, judges, shadows, and lament all appear in their stories. Yet alongside this, they also celebrated the fleeting beauty of mortal life. Their poems often seem aware that everything splendid is brief. That knowledge did not make them bleak. It made them attentive. A feast mattered because it would end. A friendship mattered because time was passing. A city mattered because it could fall. This sensitivity to impermanence may be one of the reasons Greek literature still feels so alive. It speaks softly but directly to the human condition. Rome, more practical in tone, nevertheless had its own tender awareness of loss. Many Roman epitaphs, for example, carry the simple ache of memory. They name the dead, note their virtues, or record the grief of those who remain. The empire's grandeur does not erase the intimacy of such inscriptions. A son mourns a mother. A husband remembers a wife. A freedman honors the person who once granted him a place in life. Stone can be public and private at once. This balance between the monumental and the intimate is what makes antiquity so absorbing. A palace and a cooking pot belong to the same world. A theorem and a lullaby belong to the same breath. An empire may build a triumphal arch, but the same civilization also worries about whether the wheat supply will arrive on time. Ancient life was never one thing, it was always a weave. We can linger for a little while with the Egyptian scribes, whose work reminds us that civilization depends on the written trace more than we often notice. A scribe was not just a copier, he was a custodian of order. Recording grain, labor, offerings, property, and legal matters meant converting fluid reality into a stable form. In a world where memory could fail, writing made the world legible to itself. That is an astonishing achievement. It is quiet, but it changes everything. Once a society can keep records reliably, it can manage complexity on a much larger scale. And because writing preserved ideas beyond a single lifespan, ancient civilizations learned how to speak across generations. A law code could outlive the lawgiver. A philosophical argument could survive the death of the thinker. A poem could be read in a century far beyond its composition. This gave the ancients a relationship with time that feels almost ceremonial. They built not just for the present, but for readers not yet born. In that sense, the library and the temple are cousins. Each is a shelter for continuity. The great libraries of antiquity carry a particular kind of longing because they remind us how fragile human memory can be. Some were famous, some modest, some tied to royal courts or temple institutions, some housed within schools or archives. Not all of them vanished in dramatic destruction. Many simply decayed by neglect, climate, war, or political change. The loss is difficult to imagine. A library is not just a room of books. It is a concentration of voices. When a library disappears, whole ways of seeing the world become harder to recover. And still, enough survives to suggest breadth. There were astronomical tables, medical treatises, philosophical dialogues, legal commentaries, plays, hymns, agricultural manuals, technical handbooks, private letters, tax accounts, and personal notes. Ancient people were curious in many registers. They wanted to know how to heal, how to govern, how to build, how to calculate, how to pray, how to argue, how to mourn, how to navigate, how to celebrate, how to live well enough to reach the next season. A bedtime thought can rest here for a moment. How many everyday problems must have been solved and solved again in the ancient world before any of those solutions became invisible to us? How many tools, recipes, methods, and practices existed in ordinary use without ever becoming famous? Archaeology sometimes uncovers these. A cookware fragment hints at diet, a loom weight hints at textile production, a mortar and pestle hint at cuisine, a surgeon's instrument hints at care and risk, a child's drawing scratched into plaster hints at a moment of play. The hum of civilization is often carried by such small, uncelebrated things. The idea that ancient civilizations were more advanced than we think may be most true when we realize how much they accomplished without the resources we take for granted. No engines, no electricity, no antibiotics, no satellite imaging. And yet there were cities with water systems, long-distance trade networks, public buildings, legal frameworks, astronomical observations, durable art, and social institutions that endured across generations. To make that possible required intelligence not only in isolated genius, but in collective practice. Collective practice is a beautiful phrase for what the ancients understood instinctively. A single mind can invent, but a civilization must repeat. A design matters only if masons learn it, if patrons fund it, if laborers carry it out, if maintenance continues, if successors value it. Ancient civilizations were masterful at creating cultures of transmission. Apprentices learned from elders. Priests learned ritual sequences. Builders learned proportions. Farmers learned the timings of planting and harvest. Sailors learned winds and stars. This passing down is one of the oldest forms of advancement. We might even say that ancient wisdom was often ecological before the word existed. People had to live within the limits of water, soil, climate, and season. If they ignored those limits, they suffered quickly, so they observed them with seriousness. They aligned festivals to agricultural rhythms. They placed settlements where trade and defense made sense. They built storage for lean times. They used materials available nearby and learned how to shape them effectively. Some of these choices were conservative, but conservatism in this context meant survival. A civilization is not always advanced by changing quickly. Sometimes it is advanced by learning what should remain. The Romans, for example, were famous for absorbing what worked. Their religion, art, engineering, and administration drew from many sources. They did not hesitate to borrow from the Greeks, the Etruscans, the Egyptians, and others. This was not weakness, it was practical intelligence. A civilization becomes durable when it can adapt without losing coherence. Roman legal thought, urban planning, and military logistics became part of a broader system that could stretch across diverse cultures while still holding together. Not perfectly, of course. No empire holds itself together perfectly, but the effort itself is notable. In some ways, ancient empires were forever attempting the same thing, to make distance manageable. Distance between provinces and capitals, distance between present and past, distance between the living and the dead, distance between the unknown and the explained. That is perhaps why roads, archives, and temples matter so much in our memory of them. They are all methods of reducing distance. A road collapses space. An archive collapses time. A temple collapses uncertainty into ritual and presence. And then there are the ruins, those patient remains that seem to grow more beautiful the longer they stand in silence. A ruined theatre in Greece with grass in the cracks, a Roman bath with walls open to sky, an Egyptian tomb whose painted colours have faded but not disappeared. Each of these invites a special kind of contemplation. Ruins are not simply broken things, they are time made visible. They show us what outlasts function, proportion, material, intention, and memory. Sometimes the ruins feel almost more complete in their incompleteness. A standing column in a field can suggest an entire colonnade. A single arch can imply a street of arches. A lintel carved with symbols can hint at ceremonies now forgotten. The imagination naturally fills the spaces, and in doing so it participates in archaeology. We do not merely see ruins, we translate them into feeling. This is why the ancient world remains so alive in the mind. It is not just a field of study. It is a landscape of partial visibility. Every artifact seems to say, "There was more here." And that phrase, "there was more here," is one of the quietest and most haunting phrases in history. There was more here than we can recover. More thought, more labor, more ritual, more boredom, more laughter, more waiting, more forgetting. The notion of more advanced than we think can also be softened into something gentler. Perhaps they were more humanly capable than modern habits sometimes allow us to remember. Capable of discipline, abstraction, craft, patience, and continuity. Capable of organizing vast projects over long periods. Capable of transmitting knowledge without digital tools. Capable of building things that still leave us speechless. In that sense, the ancient world does not need to be romanticized. It only needs to be respected. Respect leads us naturally to the small moral dignity of ancient work. A potter shaping clay in a workshop, a sailor checking the weather, a mason laying stones, a librarian dusting shelves, a farmer watching clouds, a physician palpating a pulse, a priest arranging offerings, a teacher tracing letters for a child. All of them participated in the same slow dignity. Not every life was noble in the public sense, but every civilization depended on such work being done with enough care to continue. And perhaps that is where bedtime thought can settle deepest, not in the grandeur of empires, but in the persistence of ordinary effort. The old world survived because enough people again and again did the next useful thing. They measured, they repaired, they remembered, they distributed, they washed, they counted, they waited, they copied, they built, they buried. They revisited the same tasks until the tasks became civilization. So if we ask whether the ancients were advanced, the answer might be yes, in ways that are easy to miss if we only admire technology. They were advanced in the art of living together under demanding conditions. They were advanced in symbol, infrastructure, law, and memory. They were advanced in patience. They were advanced in making meaning durable. And as the thought grows softer, we can imagine those civilizations now as layered lights fading one by one. First the workday light on an Egyptian riverbank, then the bright stone of a Greek sanctuary, then the red dusk over Roman roads and aqueducts, then candlelight in a chamber where a record is being written, and then silence. The lights go out, but the forms remain in memory. Somewhere a stone seal rests in a drawer. Somewhere a bronze tool lies in the earth. Somewhere a fragment of papyrus is still protected by dry sand. Somewhere a wall painting waits in dimness. Somewhere a scholar leans over a table and tries to read a faded line. Somewhere a child in the modern world looks at an old statue and feels, without naming it, a small and patient wonder. That wonder is a kind of inheritance too. It is how the ancient world continues, not as spectacle but as attention. We look and we keep looking. We ask and we keep asking. We notice the detail in a ruined doorway, the geometry of a tomb, the curve of a Greek letter, the mark of a Roman mason, the profile of a pharaoh, the shadow of a temple lintel at sunset. Each small noticing is a way of honoring the past. And now, as all of this grows quieter, it is enough to let the mind rest with the thought that history has never been a contest between the old and the new. It is a long continuity of human effort, each age borrowing, correcting, forgetting, and remembering. Egypt, Greece, and Rome were not perfect. They were not modern, they were not simple, but they were deeply skilled at creating order from uncertainty, and that skill still speaks to us across the dark. So let the old roads remain in dusk. Let the river keep its slow, remembered course. Let the marble and limestone soften into shadow. Let the archive room be cool and still. Let the amphora, the tablet, the coin, and the carved name rest in their quiet places. There is no need to solve the ancient world tonight. It is enough to feel its depth. It is enough to know that beneath the surface of our own lives lies an older intelligence, made of hands and habits, of seasons and stars, of stone and script, of faith and labor and time. It is enough to remember that people long ago built and counted and prayed and planned and cared, and that because they did, something continuous has reached us. And so the last thought can be a simple one, carried gently into sleep. The ancient world was not merely a collection of ruins. It was a living order of minds and methods, of stories and systems, of daily acts repeated until they became enduring forms. In that quiet endurance there is a comfort. In that quiet endurance there is a kind of grace. Now the lamps are low, the rooms are still, and the long chain of ages settles into the dark. Let the questions soften. Let the wonders drift. Let the stones keep their secrets a little longer. And let sleep arrive as it often does, not all at once, but slowly, like dusk over a temple, like water over worn steps, like a final hush moving through a very old and peaceful city. And if we stay with that image a little longer, we can begin to notice that the ancient world was never one world at all, but many worlds overlapping in a slow and patient pattern. Egypt was not one Egypt, but a changing river civilization that lasted so long it seems almost to belong to the imagination. Greece was not one Greece, but a scattering of city-states, islands, colonies, sanctuaries, dialects and sea paths, each with its own rhythm. Rome was not one Rome, but a city, then a republic, then an empire, then a memory that continued to shape laws and roads and calendars long after the authority itself had shifted elsewhere. To ask whether they were more advanced than we think is to ask what kind of advancement matters when the dust has settled. A civilization can be advanced in machinery, but also in organization. It can be advanced in formal knowledge, but also in the quiet craft of administration. It can be advanced in war, though that is often the least graceful form of progress, and it can be advanced in poetry, architecture, navigation, law, engineering, sanitation, astronomy, medicine, and the patient arrangement of daily life. When we look closely, the ancient world seems less like a primitive beginning and more like a different solution to the problem of being human. The Egyptians, for instance, understood continuity in a way that still feels almost architectural. Their temples were not simply houses for gods. They were carefully ordered spaces where ritual, geography, and cosmic symbolism met. The layout of a temple could reflect an understanding of procession, sacred enclosure, and the movement from light into darkness. The walls carried inscriptions not as decoration alone, but as a living record of offerings, victories, prayers, divine names, and royal legitimacy. Even the act of building was part of belief. To align stone with the heavens, to orient a monument with the river, to carve an image into permanence was to participate in a larger order. And the river, always the river, gave a rhythm to thought. The Nile was not merely water. It was a calendar, a road, a gift, and a warning. Its flood cycle shaped agriculture with such reliability that a whole civilization could learn to think in seasons of abundance and retreat. In a world like that, precision mattered, timing mattered, observation mattered. A farmer who watched the land knew things that could not be learned from theory alone. A scribe who kept accounts knew that a grain measure was not an abstraction. A builder knew that a wall slightly out of line might become a ruin years later. An administrator knew that order was a daily labor, not a single decision. This is one reason ancient Egypt still feels advanced in a quiet, almost unsettling way. Not because it resembles our age, but because it mastered systems of continuity. The same can be said of its writing. Hieroglyphs are often admired as beautiful symbols, and they are beautiful, but they were also practical. They could be monumental and sacred on temple walls, and they could exist in quicker forms for administration, letters, and record-keeping. Behind the elegance was a working bureaucracy. Behind the funerary texts and royal inscriptions was a practical society that had to measure labor, distribute resources, preserve titles, and maintain memory across generations. Memory itself was a technology. In a literate civilization, memory could be built into stone and papyrus. It could be stored in archives, copied by scribes, recited in ritual, and carried by formality from one reign to the next. Yet much of what we know about Egypt survives by accident. Dry sand preserved some things that wet climates would have destroyed. Tombs protected pigments. Burials protected furniture, linens, sandals, food offerings, and the small domestic objects that make ancient lives feel suddenly near. In these surviving details, a bed, a comb, a jar, a game board, a little carved figure, we can sense a world that was both ceremonial and practical, both grand and intimate. It is easy to think of pyramids first, because they are so enormous that they dominate the imagination. But the pyramid is only one expression of a broader ability to coordinate labor, materials, beliefs, and engineering across years or decades. The transportation of stone, the leveling of foundations, the angle of a side, the internal chambers, the relation to the landscape, the organization of workers, the food they ate, the season in which work proceeded, the documents that recorded supply and pay, these were all part of the same ancient competence. A structure like that is not only about stone, it is about administration, it is about logistics, it is about a society that knew how to persist in a plan longer than a single life. And perhaps that is one of the quiet surprises hidden in ancient history. Many of the things that feel modern are not inventions of the modern mind so much as refinements of older human habits. We may use more advanced materials, but we still depend on scheduling, measurement, record-keeping, specialized labor, trade routes, and shared standards. The difference is often not between having systems and not having systems, but between the scale and speed of the systems. The ancients understood this in their own way. Their cities depended on invisible work. Their greatness depended on the ordinary. Greece offers another kind of quiet brilliance, one that was less centralized and more conversational. If Egypt often seems to speak in stone, Greece often speaks in debate, memory, drama, and argument. The Greek world was fragmented, but that fragmentation itself generated reflection. City-states had to ask what kind of community they were, what justice meant, who should rule, how citizens should be educated, how a household related to the polis, how human beings fit into a cosmos that could be beautiful and indifferent at once. These questions did not arise in an abstract vacuum. They arose in markets, assemblies, sanctuaries, theatres, gymnasia, and schools where thought was as social as speech. Greek advancement is sometimes remembered for philosophy, and that memory is not wrong. But philosophy did not float above daily life. It grew from it. Think of the coastline, the islands, the trade, the ports, the exchange of goods and stories, the exposure to other cultures, the need to measure distance across the sea, the habit of noticing patterns in nature and politics alike. Think of the alphabet, adapted and simplified, making writing more flexible and accessible than the older systems from which it emerged. Think of the poems that preserved heroes and genealogies. Think of the hymns and prayers that joined civic identity to divine favor. Think of the theaters, where entire communities sat together in open air and watched human suffering and moral choice unfold as if held up to the light. The ancient Greeks were deeply interested in the limits of knowledge. That alone gives their civilization a kind of modern feeling, though the questions were answered in different ways. They wondered how the heavens worked, what matter was, what justice was, whether virtue could be taught, whether memory had a structure, whether the soul survived death, whether fate or choice guided a person's life. We sometimes imagine that scientific curiosity and spiritual wonder are opposites, but in the ancient world they often lived side by side. A person could observe the stars and sacrifice at a shrine. A mathematician could also live in a mythic world. An engineer could dedicate work to a god. The categories we keep separate were once much closer together. The Greeks also created one of the most enduring cultural forms in history, the idea that human life itself could be examined as a public and artistic question. Tragedy did not simply entertain, it studied suffering. It reflected on inheritance, pride, duty, and the invisible pressure of destiny. Comedy, too, gave a society room to laugh at itself, to release tension, to point gently at folly. In this way, the theatre became something like a civic mirror. It was a place where a city could think about itself while seated together in the darkening afternoon, listening to language that had been shaped with care. And there is something especially moving about the fragility of what remains from that world. A broken statue in a museum, a chipped vase, a partially preserved inscription, a line of verse copied by hand through centuries of manuscripts, a temple foundation with only a few columns still standing, these are enough to suggest a civilization of immense subtlety. Perhaps the subtlety is part of why it endures. The surviving fragments invite attention. They reward patience. They do not reveal everything at once. They ask us to stand still. Rome, in a different register, turns advancement into infrastructure. The Roman world often seems like a study in practical power. Roads, aqueducts, baths, bridges, ports, walls, legal codes, census practices, public works, military organization, and urban planning all gave Rome its character. Yet it would be too simple to reduce Rome to efficiency. Rome was also ceremonial, symbolic, literary, and deeply conscious of history. Its power relied not only on force but on administration and integration. It connected regions by giving them a framework, though often under the pressure of conquest and control. It was an empire of roads, but also of documents. It was an empire of marble, but also of ledgers. There is a special kind of intelligence in making large things function over long distances. The Romans knew how to move water, grain, soldiers, taxes, messages, and ideas. An aqueduct is a beautiful expression of practical thought. It carries water by understanding slope, gravity, and continuity. It is at once simple and astonishing. To build one is to trust geometry in the service of daily life. A road is also a line of thought made visible. It narrows distance, makes schedules possible, and binds provinces to a center. Even today, when we walk near old Roman roads or read about them, we feel the discipline of their design. They were not only routes, they were commitments. And then there is law, perhaps Rome's quietest and most lasting instrument. Law is not always dramatic, but it shapes the world more steadily than many monuments. Roman legal thought influenced later systems because it dealt with property, agreements, obligations, family, governance, citizenship, and status in ways that could be extended and refined. The idea that a society can be organized through written principles, procedures, offices, and categories is one of the oldest forms of advanced coordination. It does not glitter like gold, but it orders the future. In the long history of civilizations, law may be among the most important technologies of all, though it is made not of metal or stone, but of shared expectation. Roman cities also reveal a layered civilization. Beneath the splendor of imperial imagery were markets, workshops, tenements, kitchens, alleys, and drains. The public bath was not just about bathing. It was about social life, routine, and civic rhythm. People moved through spaces designed to accommodate conversation, relaxation, exercise, and display. In the grander houses there were mosaics, painted walls, fountains, and courtyards that created miniature worlds within the larger city. In the poorer quarters there was noise, crowding, labor, and the constant negotiation of survival. To call Rome advanced is not to ignore inequality. It is to notice that even inequality can be organized by elaborate systems, which is both impressive and sobering. One of the quiet wonders of Rome is how much of its legacy exists in ordinary verbs of civilization. To inscribe, to archive, to administer, to decree, to survey, to distribute, to equip, to pave, to connect. These are not glamorous words, but they are the vocabulary of durable states. Rome understood that power is not only a matter of armies, it is also a matter of repeatable processes. A census is repetitive, so is taxation, so is maintenance, so is citizenship when taken seriously. A civilization that survives for centuries usually survives because it can repeat itself without entirely becoming static. Rome did this in ways both admirable and destructive. When we think of ancient advancement, we sometimes focus too much on what they lacked. They lacked electricity, engines, microbiology, satellites, and computers. That is true. But if we invert the question slightly, we see that they had other things in abundance. They had close observation of the sky. They had architectural mastery without modern cranes. They had agriculture adapted to local ecologies. They had practical mathematics. They had material knowledge about stone, clay, bronze, iron, glass, plaster, dyes, timber, leather, and textiles. They had methods of communication over distance that were slow but often reliable. They had intricate religious and civic institutions. They had deep time in their minds because they lived closer to the visible traces of earlier generations. A person in the ancient world might know the local landscape in astonishing detail. They would know the birds, the wind, the texture of soil after rain, the timing of planting, the angle of sun on a given hillside, the scent of olive leaves, the sound of carts on stone, the location of springs, the names of roads, the customs of neighbors, the festivals of gods, the history of families, and the reputation of officials. Modern life can broaden knowledge across the globe, but it can also thin our intimacy with place. The ancients, especially those outside the greatest centers of power, often lived in a world of immediate and practical familiarity. That too is a form of advanced perception. There is also a quieter kind of advancement in the beauty of objects made for use. A Greek pot with its balanced curve, a Roman lamp with its molded relief, an Egyptian cosmetic spoon, a bronze mirror, a carved amulet, a stone seal, a decorated handle, a woven textile pattern, a simple tool polished by repeated use. These objects show that utility and artistry were not always separate. A useful thing could be beautiful because someone had cared enough to make it so. This is a humble thought, but it softens the imagination. It suggests that ancient people were not endlessly burdened by survival. They also cared about form, elegance, symbolism, and the tactile pleasure of a well-made object. Sometimes the question of advancement leads us to the edges of knowledge rather than its center. We wonder about vanished libraries, lost books, forgotten engineering, incomplete maps, and texts that have not survived. Alexandria becomes a symbol of this longing because it reminds us how much can disappear. A library is not only a room with books. It is a concentration of memory vulnerable to fire, neglect, political change, and time. A single lost work can alter the shape of what later generations think the past was. We are always reading the ancient world through survivors, and survivors are never the whole story. They are only the part that made it through. That incompleteness can feel sad, but it can also feel gentle. It means the past still has shadows. It means mystery has not entirely left the world. A fragment can be more haunting than a complete object because it invites the imagination to lean closer. A broken inscription asks to be deciphered. A buried harbor asks to be found. A ruined palace asks who walked there last. A myth asks why it was told, and what human need it answered. Ancient civilizations were advanced not only in what they achieved, but in the spaces they left behind for us to wonder about. Myth itself deserves a quiet thought, because myth is often mistaken for mere fantasy when it is usually a deeper form of cultural memory. In Egypt, gods traveled with the sun, passed through death, judged the soul, protected kings, and embodied cosmic principles. In Greece, gods resembled human beings closely enough to reveal human emotions in divine form, which made the myths both intimate and unsettling. In Rome, gods were often woven into public duty, law, and empire, with old Italic spirits, Greek influences, and imperial ideology blending into a practical sacred world. These stories were not only entertainment, they carried values, fears, origins, and images of order. They were ways of speaking about what could not easily be measured. A myth of a flood, a descent into the underworld, a sacred birth, a trickster, a divine judgment, a wandering hero. These are not simply old stories. They are maps of the inner and outer world as ancient people understood them. A civilization that can preserve such stories across centuries has a special kind of intelligence. It knows that not everything important can be reduced to measurement. It knows that loss, loyalty, pride, change, and mortality need symbols as much as they need explanations. And perhaps we still know this even now when we are quiet enough to admit it. The ancients also advanced by learning to live with the sky. Before electric light, the night sky was a constant presence. Stars were not distant decoration. They were timekeepers, navigational aids, divine signs, and companions to thought. The movements of planets, the rising of constellations, the return of seasons, eclipses, and the subtle shifting of the moon all shaped calendars and rituals. Astronomy began not only as curiosity, but as necessity. To know the sky was to know when to sail, when to sow, when to celebrate, when to prepare. It was a science born from patience. There is something peaceful in imagining a scribe or priest watching the heavens from a rooftop, or a Greek thinker measuring shadow lengths, or a Roman surveyor aligning a road by the lay of land and sky. These acts are modest and immense at once. They show how ancient people folded the cosmos into ordinary life. They did not think of knowledge as sealed away in laboratories. Knowledge was in the field, the temple, the workshop, the harbor, the courthouse, the bath, the home. It was distributed through the whole of existence. Medicine, too, reveals a mixture of limitation and skill. Ancient healers could not do what modern medicine does, but they often observed the body carefully. They understood that environment, diet, wound care, bathing, rest, and timing mattered. Herbal remedies, surgical instruments, bone setting, and medical texts all point to a long and earnest attempt to reduce suffering. Even when their theories were not correct by modern standards, their attention was serious. A civilization that studies the body is a civilization trying to know the boundary between life and fragility. That is a solemn kind of progress. We may also notice that ancient empires, especially Egypt and Rome, understood spectacle as a tool of order. Monumental architecture can impress, unify, intimidate, and sanctify. A temple approach, a triumphal route, a public forum, a palace court, a ceremonial avenue, all shape how people feel their place in a world larger than themselves. Yet spectacle alone does not sustain a civilization. It must be matched by granaries, roads, tax records, work schedules, water systems, laws, and the unnoticed labor of many hands. The visible and invisible parts of civilization are always braided together. And perhaps the most advanced thing about the ancients was not any single achievement, but their long familiarity with impermanence. They built knowing that buildings age. They wrote knowing that scripts change. They planted knowing that drought might come. They ruled knowing that dynasties fall. They told stories knowing that memory fades. They buried the dead in ways that hoped for endurance beyond the grave because they knew how short life could be. In that awareness there is both sorrow and elegance. A civilization that knows it is temporary may become more careful, more symbolic, more attentive to pattern. Modern people sometimes imagine progress as a straight line upward, but the ancient world suggests something gentler and more circular. Skills can be lost and rediscovered. Knowledge can narrow and widen again. Cities can rise, decline, and leave foundations beneath newer streets. Languages can evolve from older forms. Laws can borrow from forgotten precedents. Religious imagery can survive in new guises. Even a broken column can influence an architect centuries later. The past is not gone, it has simply changed its shape. There are still so many quiet marvels in the ancient record: the precision of a bronze fitting, the elegance of a mosaic floor, the consistency of brick sizes in a city district, the way a road continues in a nearly straight line across a landscape long after the empire that made it has gone, the careful stacking of jars in a storehouse, the color used on a tomb wall, the alignment of a sacred doorway with a sunrise, the preserved loaf of bread, the fishing net, the writing tablet, the footprint in hardened mud. These details tell us that the ancients inhabited a world of practical refinement. They were not merely surviving, They were shaping environments. Even their mistakes can seem advanced in a strange way because mistakes reveal ambition. A collapsed building suggests an attempt at scale. An unfinished inscription suggests interruption, not absence of care. A debated philosophical text suggests a mind willing to question itself. A failed expedition, a miscalculated calendar, a disputed succession, a broken treaty, all of these show that ancient societies were deeply engaged in the hard work of governing complexity. Complexity did not begin with us. It has been with humanity for a very long time, and there is tenderness in that thought. Human beings have always lived at the edge of what they could control. They have always arranged their days around larger forces, whether those forces were the river flood, the grain harvest, the gods, the emperor, the senate, the city, the family, or the weather. The ancients built systems to hold uncertainty in manageable forms. That is not so different from what people still do now. We make calendars, save records, draft plans, build shelters, mark anniversaries, tell stories, and hope that the structures we create will outlast the moment. Egypt, Greece, and Rome are often grouped together because they are foundational to later Western history, but each had its own emotional climate. Egypt can feel contemplative, priestly, and timeless. Greece can feel questioning, luminous, argumentative, and poetic. Rome can feel orderly, ambitious, civic, and durable. Yet all three share a deep respect for form. They believed that the shape of a thing mattered. A proper tomb, a well-turned phrase, a just law, a symmetrical temple, a measured road, a rightly performed ritual, all of these had consequences. Form was not superficial. It was a way of aligning human life with something larger. In our own age, form still matters, though we often forget to notice it. The arrangement of a room, the design of a street, the order of a library, the layout of a city, the structure of a sentence, the rhythm of a repeated practice, all quietly shape the mind. The ancients understood this instinctively. They turned order into a visible environment. Their palaces, forums, sanctuaries, and tombs expressed beliefs about the universe and society in materials that could endure for centuries. Even now, we can feel those beliefs in the spaces they left behind, and if we listen very gently, we might hear another lesson from them. Civilization is not a single invention. It is a repeated agreement to maintain memory, care for the vulnerable, move water, store grain, teach children, honor the dead, settle disputes, and make something more lasting than a moment. This agreement is fragile. It is renewed in every generation. Sometimes it breaks. Sometimes it is repaired. Sometimes it becomes rigid. Sometimes it becomes generous. But in all cases, it depends on ordinary people doing ordinary work with enough constancy that the whole fabric holds. So perhaps the ancients were advanced in the deepest sense. They knew how to build fabrics of meaning. They knew how to weave labor and belief, administration and ritual, craft and story into a life that could endure. They were not more advanced than we are in every way, but neither were they simple or dim. They were capable, inventive, observant, and profoundly human. They lived close to the foundations of many things we still depend upon. And now, as the thought settles even further, it may be enough to imagine a few final scenes lingering softly in the mind. A dawn in Egypt where the river catches light and a boat moves silently along the bank. A terrace in Greece where an old man listens to a younger voice argue about justice. A Roman courtyard where water slips from a fountain into a basin and a household begins the day in measured quiet. A library room with scrolls tied and stacked. A workshop with fine dust on the floor. A hilltop sanctuary. A road disappearing into warm distance. A tomb sealed with care. A marketplace waking slowly. A harbour with ropes, nets, jars, and gulls. These scenes do not need to be dramatic. They only need to exist in the imagination long enough to remind us that history was lived 1 hour at a time. The ancients did not wake each morning as symbols. They woke as people. They worried about food, weather, status, illness, work, family, ritual, and death. They also marveled, hoped, laughed, built, and remembered. That ordinary fullness is perhaps the most advanced thing of all. So let the question remain gentle rather than sharp. Were ancient civilizations more advanced than we think? In many ways, yes, because we underestimate the depth of their systems, the subtlety of their knowledge, and the endurance of their achievements. But the answer is also softer than a verdict. They were advanced in the ways that mattered to them, and their advances were braided with belief, labor, and time. They were not trying to become us, they were trying to live well within their own world. And that is enough for tonight. Let the papyrus remain folded, let the marble remain cool, let the river keep moving through the dark, let the road stretch on in moonlight, let the temple stand with its shadowed doorway, let the archive sleep, let the stars continue their patient turning above civilizations old and new. There is no need to reach a final conclusion now. It is enough to feel the continuity. It is enough to rest inside the long human story, where each generation borrows a little from the one before and leaves a little for the one after, like a lamp passed carefully from hand to hand in a quiet corridor. And as sleep comes closer, let it come with the calm dignity of ancient dusk settling over stone, over water, over fields, over painted walls, over old streets, over broken columns, over sealed jars, over names half remembered and still beloved. Let it come like a blessing from a very old world, not demanding to be solved, only gently received. And perhaps before sleep fully closes the door on the day, it is worth lingering a little longer with the idea that history is not only a sequence of events, but also a sequence of inheritances. What one civilization learns in one age may be forgotten, translated, simplified, preserved, or transformed in another. Knowledge does not always move in a straight line. Sometimes it travels like water through channels, sometimes like a rumor, sometimes like a seed carried far from its original soil. This is one reason the ancient world feels so quietly mysterious. So much of it survives only in fragments: a broken inscription, a repaired statue, a half-buried roadway, a recipe copied by a later hand, a myth that may preserve the shape of an older memory, a tool whose exact use is uncertain, a building whose purpose can be guessed but never fully known. The past arrives to us in pieces, and the pieces are often beautiful enough to make us long for the missing whole. Egypt, for instance, still seems to stand just beyond the edge of complete understanding, even though so much of it has been studied for so long. The sheer duration of Egyptian civilization is almost difficult to hold in the mind. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals shifted, religious ideas changed and reappeared in new forms. Foreign rulers came and became Egyptian in their own way. Art styles evolved slowly, as if respecting continuity while still allowing subtle differences to accumulate like sediment. Through all of it, the river remained, not unchanged exactly, but dependable enough to make permanence feel possible. That may be part of why so much Egyptian architecture feels aligned with eternity. The pyramids, the temples, the tombs, the processional ways, the alignment to stars and horizons, all of it suggests a civilization thinking not only about the present administration of a kingdom, but about cosmic order, memory, and the life of the soul. The Egyptians were intensely practical in many respects. They measured land after the flood. They managed grain. They organized labor. They kept records. They developed medicine, mathematics, and engineering for worldly needs. But they also wove these ordinary tasks into a larger vision of balance, a concept often summarized as mat, a word that carries the sense of order, truth, rightness, and harmonious structure. It is easy to say that a civilization built pyramids and therefore must have been advanced, but the deeper question is what kind of advancement the pyramids represent. Not merely a technical one, though the technical achievement is astonishing enough. They represent coordination across generations, mastery of logistics, patient labor, precise observation, social organization, and a shared agreement that some structures are worth enormous effort because they connect earthly life with what lies beyond it. The stone is not only stone, it is also memory made durable. And in Greece, the landscape of thought feels different, though no less remarkable. If Egypt often evokes continuity, Greece often evokes conversation. Not only in the famous sense of philosophy, but in the quieter sense of a culture that seems to ask questions in many directions at once. What is justice? What is courage? What is beauty? What is the best life for a human being? What is the nature of the gods? What is change? What is permanence? What can be known and how can it be known? These are not small questions, and they appear across poetry, drama, politics, mathematics, architecture, and daily life. A Greek city-state could be small in territory and immense in self-importance, and yet within that limited geography there could arise temples, civic debates, athletic festivals, legal reforms, histories, tragedies, comedies, medical treatises, and startlingly abstract speculation. The world of classical Greece is often remembered through a few shining names, but it was made by many thousands of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by the sea, the market, the farm, the household, the sanctuary, and the assembly. Behind every preserved text there were mouths that spoke and ears that listened. Behind every statue there were hands that measured, cut, polished, and lifted. The Greeks, too, were not floating above material reality. They were attentive to it. They studied geometry because lines and angles could be both useful and beautiful. They watched the stars and the seasons. They charted ships across the water. They built theatres into hillsides so that voices could carry through open air. Their myths, for all their wonder, were not escapes from reality so much as attempts to make sense of it through image and story. Zeus, Athene, Apollo, Demeter, Hermes, Poseidon, these were not merely characters in a distant tale. They were ways of naming forces, patterns, tensions, and hopes that could be felt in human life. The sea could be both life-giving and dangerous. Wisdom could be strategic. Fertility could be seasonal and fragile. Communication could be quick, clever, and unreliable. A myth could hold all of that at once in a form that could be remembered. And in Rome, the mood changes again. Rome feels more administrative, more structured, more outwardly confident, though it also contains profound anxiety beneath the surface. The Romans inherited from others, especially from the Greeks and from the peoples of Italy and beyond, and then transformed what they received into something vast and durable. They cared about law, roads, armies, citizenship, engineering, public spectacle, household order, religion, and practical administration on a scale that is still astonishing. Their genius lay partly in organization, partly in adaptation, and partly in a relentless ability to make systems that could endure long enough to become ordinary. Roman roads are often described as if they are merely roads, but they were also a philosophy expressed in stone and dirt and labor. They connected places, certainly, but they also connected power. They allowed movement, taxation, military deployment, trade, message delivery, and cultural exchange. They made the empire feel less like a collection of distant edges and more like a network with a center, even when that center was imagined differently depending on time and circumstance. A road can seem simple until one thinks about the surveying, the drainage, the labor, the maintenance, the legal rights, and the political will required to keep it functioning over long distances. And then there is the Roman eye for the everyday institution. The aqueduct, the bath, the forum, the granary, the law court, the archive, the census, the title, the seal, the contract. These are not romantic in the same way as a myth of thunder on a mountain, but they are one of the reasons empires feel real in the historical record. They leave traces because they were meant to structure life. A bathhouse is not merely a building where people wash. It is a place where classes mingle, where conversation flows, where leisure is organized, where heat and water become social architecture. An aqueduct is not only a channel. It is an assertion that a city can capture, move, and distribute a precious resource through foresight and engineering. It is tempting to separate spiritual sophistication from practical sophistication, as if one civilization must be poetic and another bureaucratic. But the ancient world rarely allowed such neat divisions. The same society that produced a ritual calendar also produced tax records. The same people who told stories about gods also experimented with medicine, metallurgy, navigation, or legal procedure. The same hand that painted a tomb might also measure grain. Human beings tend to become most interesting when their minds are allowed to range across more than one way of knowing. This is perhaps why so many ancient achievements still surprise us when we encounter them in detail. There is a quiet shock in realizing how much calculation, observation, and memory were embedded in forms that can look primitive from a distance. A temple orientation, a city plan, a drainage system, a calendar adjustment, a ship design, a surgical instrument, a votive offering placed in a pattern, a fresco that encodes cosmology and status, a coin image that moves through the hands of traders, a decree carved into stone. These things are not random. They are evidence of minds working carefully in conditions that were often difficult, uncertain, and physically demanding. Some of the mystery of ancient civilizations comes from the fact that their surviving achievements are often the results of long chains of cooperation. It is easy to admire a single structure and imagine a single genius, but the truth is usually broader and more human. One generation begins something, another refines it, another copies it, another repairs it. Another misunderstands a piece and changes it slightly. Over time, the structure becomes a record of many hands and many decisions. A city is not one mind, it is a chorus. And sometimes the chorus continues even when the original words are no longer fully remembered. That is why lost knowledge feels so poignant. We know, for example, that the ancient world contained technical practices that were not always preserved in full. Recipes, dyes, alloys, construction methods, water-lifting devices, astronomical calculations, medical treatments, and literary forms could vanish when the institutions supporting them changed. A library might burn, a school might close, a trade route might collapse, a language might evolve so much that old inscriptions become obscure. In some cases, later civilizations rediscover ideas in new ways. In other cases, the knowledge simply disappears into silence, leaving only a hint in a surviving text or an object that resists easy explanation. This does not mean the ancients were more advanced than we are in the sense of having hidden futuristic power. It means they were more advanced than a careless imagination might assume. They were not living in a world of helplessness and guesswork. They had institutions of learning, systems of record-keeping, traditions of apprenticeship, and practical intelligence refined through generations. A mason knew stone, a scribe knew signs, a physician knew bodies, a sailor knew currents and weather, a priest knew ritual sequence, a merchant knew credit, trust, and risk, a farmer knew soil, seed, and flood. Each of these forms of expertise mattered. And it may be comforting in a way to remember that most of history was lived at this scale, not in the grand abstractions that fill textbooks, but in the repetition of skilled attention. Someone sharpened a bronze blade, someone mixed mortar, someone copied a text and made a small error that a later scholar would puzzle over, someone counted amphorae in a storehouse, someone braided rope, someone arranged a funeral procession, someone taught a child how to speak politely to an elder. Someone paused at a doorway to look at the sky and judge whether rain was coming. The past becomes less remote when one notices these small continuities. Our tools change, our cities change, our languages change, but the underlying human activities remain recognizable. We still store grain, though in different forms. We still move water. We still keep records. We still debate justice. We still fear illness. We still bury the dead with care. We still tell stories to explain the world. We still hope that some part of what we build will outlast us. In that sense, the ancients can feel less like vanished strangers and more like distant relatives. Their houses differed from ours. Their roads differed from ours. Their gods may be absent from the beliefs of many people now, but the human structure beneath those beliefs remains familiar. They loved family, honor, reputation, ritual, survival, and the continuity of names. They knew the ache of political upheaval. They knew the instability of harvests. They knew the tension between individual desire and social obligation. They knew that memory can be precious and unreliable at once. Egyptian tombs preserve this feeling especially well. A tomb is a place built against forgetting. It holds names, images, offerings, prayers, and instructions. It may speak of food for the dead, company for the dead, protection for the dead, or the hope that the dead continue in another realm where order is somehow maintained. To step into such a space, even in the imagination, is to enter a room designed around the persistence of identity. It is a quiet place, yet its quietness is purposeful. It does not deny death, it negotiates with it. Greek funerary practices, too, remind us how closely memory and community were tied together. The dead were not absent in a simple sense. They remained in the stories told about them, in the rituals performed for them in the family line, in the city's collective remembrance of ancestors and founders, in the poems that could transform an individual life into a model or warning for others. Tragedy itself often feels like a kind of civic memory, preserving the cost of pride, the danger of blindness, the fragility of human plans. A play could be performed once, but its emotional echo could last much longer. Rome developed this into a broader culture of public memory. There were triumphs, inscriptions, ancestral masks, tombs along roadsides, statues in fora, and histories written to frame the meaning of national greatness and loss. Memory in Rome was political, social, familial, and ceremonial. It was also selective. Empires remember themselves carefully. They choose what to celebrate and what to leave in shadow. And yet even this selection tells us something. It reveals what a civilization believes deserves endurance. One reason ancient history remains so compelling is that it invites us to think about limits. What can a society achieve with bronze, stone, muscle, wind, wax tablets, papyrus, and time? What can human beings accomplish before machines, before electricity, before modern chemistry, before printing on a massive scale? The answer is often more than we first imagine. But there is a gentleness in that realization too. It reminds us that complexity does not begin with us. It is not as though the world was simple until very recently. Complexity is old, cooperation is old, specialization is old, long-distance exchange is old, political abstraction is old, architectural ambition is old, the desire to preserve and classify and measure and beautify is old. This does not reduce the modern world, it simply places it within a broader human sequence. We are not the first to ask whether our ancestors were underestimated. We are not the first to inherit incomplete records and wonder what lies behind them. We are not the first to stand before a ruin and sense that the living reality of its builders was larger than the surviving stones. In a way, every generation looks back and discovers that its predecessors were both less and more than expected, less in some technologies, more in some subtle disciplines of life. Sometimes the most advanced thing a civilization can develop is not a device but a habit of record keeping, a habit of urban maintenance, a habit of legal reasoning, a habit of literary reflection, a habit of asking why, a habit of transmitting skill, a habit of making beauty public, a habit of treating the dead with dignity. These habits do not glitter like gold, but they create civilizations that can hold together. And if we look at ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome with that thought in mind, the picture becomes richer and quieter. Egypt gave the world an enduring model of sacred kingship, monumental building, and symbolic continuity with the cosmos. Greece gave the world models of inquiry, civic argument, artistic form, and philosophical questioning. Rome gave the world models of law, administration, infrastructure, and the organization of vast territories. None of these civilizations stood apart from the others. They traded, borrowed, fought, admired, translated, and transformed. The Mediterranean was not a sealed stage but a moving sea carrying ships, ideas, grain, statues, alphabets, and rumors. A lone sail on the horizon could mean many things: trade, war, pilgrimage, exile, news, a new god, a new decree, a return home. The ancient world was full of such arrivals, and each arrival changed the pattern a little. That is how history works so often, not by dramatic replacement but by accumulation. One custom meets another. One building stands atop another. One language absorbs words from another. One god is identified with another. One technology is adapted and improved. One memory survives in a festival long after its original meaning has shifted. There is something soothing in this layeredness. It suggests that civilization is not a single fragile invention that must be built perfectly once and then preserved unchanged. It is more resilient and more vulnerable than that. It is a continuous act of maintenance. A road must be cleared, a canal must be dredged, a text must be recopied, a law must be interpreted, a story must be retold, a temple must be repaired, a harbor must be watched, a child must be taught, a household must be fed, a city must be governed. No one does all of this alone. No one ever did. Even the great figures we remember were surrounded by systems they did not invent from nothing. Pharaohs inherited priestly traditions. Greek philosophers inherited myth, poetry, mathematics, and civic custom. Roman emperors inherited republican language, military structures, and bureaucratic habits. The individuals were remarkable, yes, but they were also expressions of a wider world. Greatness in the ancient world often meant the ability to gather existing strengths and give them new shape. And that may be the softest answer to the question, were ancient civilizations more advanced than we think? Yes, if by advanced we mean capable of extraordinary organization, subtle thought, durable art, and profound adaptation. Yes, if by advanced we mean able to live with cosmic questions while also managing water, grain, law, and trade. Yes, if by advanced we mean that their achievements were often more sophisticated than modern casual memory allows. But also no, if by advanced we mean some simple ladder on which history marches upward without loss. The ancient world was not a precursor in a crude sense. It was a complete human world in its own right. And perhaps that is the most restful way to hold it, not as a competition, but as a lineage. Not as a puzzle demanding a final answer, but as a long, dimly lit corridor of inhabited rooms. Each room has its own light, each has its own texture of sound. One room smells of wet stone after rain, another of olive oil and dust, another of incense and papyrus, another of iron and smoke, another of salt air, another of wool, wood, and baked bread. We pass through these rooms in thought, and for a little while we can almost hear the footsteps of those who came before. Some of them were kings, some were priests, some were philosophers, some were labourers, some were scribes, some were potters, weavers, sailors, farmers, midwives, soldiers, shepherds, and children. Most of them are unnamed in the surviving record, yet they were the civilization, not the monuments alone, not the famous texts alone, but the countless daily acts that made those things possible. So as the night deepens, it may help to imagine not only the great stone facades and polished statues, but also the humble scenes behind them. A hand dipping a reed pen into ink, a woman grinding grain beside a doorway, a builder setting one block against another, a student reciting lines in a shaded colonnade, a clerk sealing a document with wax, a sailor checking the sky, a physician preparing a remedy from herbs and oil, a family sharing bread in the fading light, a child asking a question that has never been asked in exactly that way before. These are the moments that quietly carry history forward, and now the question itself can soften just a little. Were ancient civilizations more advanced than we think? Perhaps the better phrasing is that they were more intricate, more capable, and more deeply human than we often remember. They did not need our machines to possess intelligence. They did not need our vocabulary to possess insight. They did not need our age to possess ambition. They built with what they had, thought with what they knew, believed with what they could imagine, and endured far beyond the lives of the individuals who first raised their walls. There is peace in remembering that. There is peace in seeing that the human story has always included both brilliance and limitation, both invention and forgetting, both grandeur and routine. Ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome were not perfect. They were full of hierarchy, violence, inequality, and loss, as all large civilizations are. But they were also full of care, curiosity, skill, and meaning. They left us ruins, yes, but also methods. They left us questions, yes, but also answers. They left us myths, laws, roads, measurements, poems, and silent stones under open skies. And so the mind can let them fade gently now, not as vanished things, but as continuing presences in the deeper background of the world. The river still moves, the stars still turn, the road still leads somewhere, the old stones still hold warmth from the day, the archive remains in the imagination, its scrolls asleep in their cases, the temple stands in the dusk, the harbour grows quiet, the forum empties. The hillside theatre is dark. The pyramid catches the last pale trace of light. The olive trees stand with their silvery leaves. The sea breathes softly against the shore. All of it is older than a single life and still somehow near. So let sleep come with that nearness. Let it come as a gentle untying of thoughts, a loosening of questions, a slow drift away from certainty and toward rest. There is no need to solve the ancient world tonight. There is only the comfort of having walked beside it for a little while, and the calm realization that human beings have been thinking, building, doubting, and dreaming for a very long time. And in that long time they made beauty, they made order, they made memory. They made paths for us to follow, even if we do not always notice them. Now the paths may grow dim, the rooms may quiet, the papyrus may lie folded, the marble may cool, the river may keep its patient course under the stars. And the ancient civilizations, with all their questions and all their quiet genius, may rest in the mind like a distant lamp, still glowing softly through the night.